That is all the time it takes. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Between the moment a button is pressed in Iran and the moment a missile hits the ground in central Israel. Not 6 minutes, not 10. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. And here's the part that should make every single person watching this video stop and think, Israel's missile warning system needs a full 6 minutes to complete its warning cycle. 6 minutes to detect, calculate, track, transmit alerts, sound sirens, and give civilians enough time to reach a shelter. 4 minutes and 20 seconds versus 6 minutes. That means by the time the sirens go off, by the time your phone buzzes, by the time you hear the sound, the missile has already landed. The warning is not a warning anymore. It is a notification. A notification that tells you what just happened, not what is about to happen. This is not a scene from a science fiction movie. This is not a hypothetical. This is what is happening right now, in real time, in the skies above the Middle East. And what we are about to walk through together is not just a story about one missile, or one war, or even one region. This is a story about how the rules of modern warfare just got rewritten overnight. About how decades of military investment, billions of dollars in defense technology, and some of the most sophisticated air defense systems ever built were just exposed in a way that no one in the Pentagon, no one in Tel Aviv, and no one on Wall Street was fully prepared for. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this happened, why it changes everything, and what it means for the global economy, for energy prices, for every country connected to the Persian Gulf, and for the entire world order as we know it. Stay with me, because the story only gets more intense from here. Let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand where we are today, you have to understand how we got here. For years, tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been simmering at a dangerous level. Iran had been advancing its nuclear program at a pace that alarmed not only the West, but even several Arab nations in the Gulf. Indirect talks, sanctions, threats, and counter-threats had become the language of diplomacy in this part of the world. Just days before the conflict exploded into open warfare, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was publicly saying that a historic agreement between Tehran and Washington was within reach. The Omani foreign minister, who had been mediating those indirect talks in Geneva, declared that peace was closer than ever. Iran had even signaled a willingness to make significant concessions on its nuclear program. And then everything fell apart. On February 28, 2026, in the early hours of the morning, the skies over Tehran lit up. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, a campaign that would later be codenamed Operation Epic Fury. Strikes hit Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah simultaneously. The targets were Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its ballistic missile program, its military command centers, and its political leadership. Within hours of the strike's beginning, Iranian state media confirmed the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led Iran for over 3 decades, who had defined its foreign policy and its ideology, was gone. Along with him, his daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild were reported killed in the strike that destroyed his compound. The entire world held its breath. Iran's response was not going to be small. Anyone who understood the Iranian military, the Revolutionary Guards, and the deep culture of resistance that runs through the country's political identity knew that the retaliation was going to be unlike anything the region had seen. And what Iran did next, in the Strait of Hormuz, and across the Gulf, and in the skies above Israel, that is what we are going to spend the next several minutes breaking down in detail. Because it is the response that changed this conflict from a military operation into something far more dangerous and far more consequential for the entire planet. Within the first 24 hours of the US-Israel strikes, Iran launched what can only be described as a saturation attack. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were fired simultaneously, targeting not just Israel, but US military bases in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. The scale was staggering. Iran did not just retaliate against the countries that attacked it. Iran opened up every front it could, targeting the entire US military posture in the region in a single coordinated wave. The IRGC announced that it had launched strikes against at least 27 US bases across the Middle East. In the first day alone, over 700 drones and nearly 500 ballistic missiles were fired. Those numbers are almost impossible to process. But what came next made those numbers look like a warm-up act. This is where the Fattah-2 enters the story. Iran had been developing the Fattah missile program for years. The original Fattah, unveiled in June 2023, was already a remarkable piece of engineering. A medium-range ballistic missile with a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, designed specifically to defeat Israel's layered missile defense systems. Traditional ballistic missiles follow a predictable arc. You can calculate where they're going. You can intercept them. The Fattah was designed to change its trajectory in the terminal phase, making that calculation far more difficult. But the Fattah-2 is something else entirely. The Fattah-2 is not just a better version of the original, it is a fundamentally different class of weapon. Where the Fattah-1 used a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, the Fattah-2 uses a hypersonic glide vehicle. The difference matters enormously, and it is worth spending a moment to understand why. A hypersonic glide vehicle detaches from its rocket booster at high altitude and then glides through the upper atmosphere at extreme speed, while continuously changing its direction in both pitch and yaw. It is not following a ballistic arc. It is not descending in a predictable trajectory. It is skating across the edge of the atmosphere like a flat stone skipping across water, only at a speed of Mach 15. That is 15 times the speed of sound. That is 11,500 miles per hour. That is 3.1 miles every single second. Now, let us talk about why that destroys the logic of every existing missile defense system. Israel operates one of the most sophisticated layered missile defense networks ever constructed. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets. David's Sling was built for medium-range threats. Arrow 3 was designed to intercept ballistic missiles in space above the atmosphere. Patriot batteries add another layer. And the U.S. deployed THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, specifically to handle ballistic threats at high altitude. Each of these systems was designed with a specific threat profile in mind. Each of them was built on one fundamental assumption, that you can predict where the incoming weapon is going and position an interceptor in its path. The Fattah-2 violates that assumption completely. Arrow 3 is designed for targets above 100 kilometers altitude. The Fattah-2 glides below 50 kilometers. Arrow 3 cannot engage it. David's Sling is optimized for threats flying at Mach 5 to Mach 8. The Fattah-2 is flying at Mach 15. David's Sling was not built for that speed envelope. THAAD struggles with weapons that maneuver during their glide phase because its interceptors need to predict a flight path and place themselves in front of the target. When the target changes direction during flight, that prediction fails. A defense analyst put it this way: intercepting a hypersonic glide vehicle with a single interceptor is like trying to defend LeBron James with one player. You can chase him all day, but you're not going to stop him from scoring. The only approach that could work is zone defense. Multiple interceptors covering defined areas and engaging the threat as it passes through. But Israel has not built that system yet. And even if it decided to build it today, defense experts estimate it would take years and cost tens of billions of dollars to deploy. So in the meantime, Iran's Fattah-2 arsenal can, in the words of Military Watch magazine, penetrate Israeli defenses with impunity. And now back to those 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Tehran to Tel Aviv is 990 miles. At Mach 15, the Fattah-2 covers that distance in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Israel's Home Front Command needs 6 minutes to complete its full warning cycle. Detect the launch, calculate the trajectory, determine the impact zone, transmit alerts to regional servers, push notifications to phones, sound physical sirens in the right neighborhoods, and give civilians time to move to shelters. The minimum shelter reach time for most locations in Tel Aviv is 90 seconds. The missile is already in the air before the first radar ping even reaches the analysis stage. By the time the sirens sound, the explosion has already happened. People hear the siren and start moving, and the blast is behind them, not in front of them. The system that kept Israeli civilians safe for 15 years was not designed for a weapon that travels this fast. Now here is what makes this even more strategically significant. Reports confirm that at least 3 successful Fattah-2 strikes penetrated Israeli air defenses between March 1st and March 4th, hitting high-value military targets. One of those strikes hit a fortified IDF command center, killing multiple senior officers. When the Israelis watched the footage back, they could see their interceptors. Not 1, not 2, but more than 10 interceptors fired at the incoming missile. All of them missed. The Fattah-2 changed its trajectory multiple times, flying at a low enough altitude that Arrow 3 could not engage it, and at a high enough speed that David's Sling could not track it. It arrived at its target and detonated. Israeli Vice President of Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, one of the country's most prominent defense technology companies, publicly described hypersonic missiles as a new era in air defense. That is not spin. That is the Israeli defense industry telling you in public that they do not have an answer right now. Meanwhile, the conflict was expanding in ways that were reshaping the entire region. Iran's strikes on Gulf countries were unlike anything those nations had experienced. Dubai, one of the most modern and supposedly secure cities on the planet, a global business hub, a financial center, a tourism powerhouse, was hearing air raid sirens. Explosions were reported in both Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Smoke was visible from landmarks. Qatar's capital Doha had blasts echoing through its commercial district. In Bahrain, Iranian drones hit a residential building in the capital, Manama. Kuwait's international airport had 2 fuel depots struck, triggering a massive fire. Saudi Arabia reported Iranian drones targeting its oil-rich eastern region and the Sheba oil field. Riyadh's diplomatic quarter saw an attempted strike that was intercepted at the last moment. In Jordan, a country that had been largely kept out of previous regional conflicts, 119 Iranian missiles and drones were fired. Britain's military base in Cyprus was struck by a drone, and Turkey, a NATO member, reported that NATO air defenses shot down an Iranian ballistic missile in Turkish airspace. That was the first time in history that an Iranian ballistic missile had entered NATO airspace and been engaged. The implications of that single event rippled immediately through every NATO capital in Europe. Iran's strategy in targeting Gulf countries was layered and deliberate. Those countries host U.S. military bases. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is one of the largest U.S. air operations hubs in the world. Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, and the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, these are the logistical spine of American military power in the Middle East. By targeting them alongside Israel, Iran was trying to stretch the entire U.S. defense posture to its breaking point. And by attacking the civilian infrastructure of Gulf cities, Iran was sending a different kind of message to the governments of the Gulf, a message that said, your cities, your airports, your oil installations, your stadiums and shopping malls and tourist districts are all within range. Every choice you make has consequences. Every base you allow the Americans to use from your soil makes you a legitimate target in our eyes. The Gulf states were outraged. Saudi Arabia called Iran's attacks reprehensible. Qatar's prime minister issued a statement strongly condemning the strikes and calling Iran's justifications totally rejected. The Gulf Cooperation Council issued a joint statement describing the attacks as dangerous acts of aggression threatening regional security. A joint statement from the US, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE affirmed the right to self-defense and said that Gulf countries would take all necessary measures to defend their security and stability, including the option of responding to the aggression. The UAE, in one of the most symbolically powerful moves of the entire crisis, recalled its ambassador to Israel, a signal that even Israel's Abraham Accords partners were reaching a breaking point. But there was a deeper fracture opening up inside Iran itself, and it was visible to the world. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian went on television and apologized to neighboring countries. He specifically addressed the Gulf states, saying that Iran did not intend to invade or attack its neighbors and pledging to halt strikes against countries from whose soil attacks on Iran were not originating. He said, and these words carry enormous weight, that he personally apologized. Within hours of that apology, Iran fired rockets at a U.S. airbase in the UAE. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, did not stop. Hardline cleric Hamid Rasai attacked the president on social media, calling his apology weak, unprofessional, and unacceptable. The fracture between Iran's civilian government and the IRGC was no longer something that analysts were theorizing about. It was happening in public, in real time, for the entire world to see. This matters strategically, because it meant that Iran was not operating as a single unified actor. There were two power centers sending contradictory signals, one trying to limit the war's geographic spread, and one determined to escalate at every opportunity. And when you are trying to negotiate a ceasefire, when you are trying to understand what the other side actually wants, that kind of internal confusion makes everything exponentially more dangerous. Now, let us talk about the thing that will affect every single person watching this video, no matter where you live in the world. The Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. It is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through that 21-mile corridor passes approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply. 20%. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on the planet has to pass through that strait. Saudi Arabian crude, Emirati crude, Kuwaiti oil, Qatari LNG, all of it goes through the Strait of Hormuz before it reaches refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Japan gets nearly 90% of its oil through that strait. South Korea depends on it. China is one of the world's biggest consumers of Gulf oil, and a significant portion of that supply runs through Hormuz. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, the world felt it immediately. U.S. crude oil prices spiked above $100 per barrel for the first time since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Within days, U.S. crude hit $108 per barrel, an 18% jump in a single session. That is the biggest daily gain in oil futures trading history going back to 1983. Brent crude, the global benchmark, surged above $107 per barrel. Airline fuel costs spiked. Shipping costs surged. Petrochemical feedstocks for plastics, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals became dramatically more expensive. Every product that uses energy to manufacture, transport, or store, which is essentially every product on Earth, became more expensive overnight. Saudi Arabia's Aramco CEO, Amin Nasser, warned publicly that the closure of Hormuz was blocking sizable volumes of oil from the whole region, and that if this takes a long time, that will have serious impact on the global economy. The CEO of one of the world's largest oil companies saying those words in public is not routine. That is a signal. G7 finance ministers announced they were preparing to release emergency energy reserves to stabilize markets. France announced it was sending an aircraft carrier toward the Mediterranean to participate in a potential mission to reopen the strait. President Emmanuel Macron coordinated with allies on the plan. Egypt's president declared his country was in a state of near economic emergency, as regional disruption threatened to drive up food and energy import costs for a population that is already under severe financial pressure. China, which produces far less oil than it consumes and depends enormously on Gulf imports to keep its industrial economy running, was watching the situation with deep alarm. Rob Thummel, portfolio manager at Tortoise Capital, said China was one of the biggest potential losers in this conflict precisely because higher prices affect growth, but physical supply disruption threatens the engine of its entire economy. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi condemned the U.S.-Israeli attack as unacceptable, calling it blatant killing of a sovereign leader and incitement of regime change. But Beijing had to tread carefully, because openly supporting Iran risked straining its relationship with Gulf states and with Western trading partners simultaneously. The economic disruption extended beyond oil. Gulf countries that had been among the most stable and attractive destinations for global investment, places that sovereign wealth funds and multinational corporations had spent years building relationships with, were now watching drones fly over their skylines. The UAE had spent decades cultivating a brand as the most stable, predictable, business-friendly environment in the Middle East. That brand was taking real damage. Insurance premiums for ships operating in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea surged. Major shipping companies began rerouting tankers around the Horn of Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional cost per voyage. Aviation corridors were disrupted. Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways, airlines that serve as major global connectors between Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, were navigating airspace closures and route changes in real time. The financial markets told the story in numbers. Stock markets across Asia, Europe, and the Americas fell sharply on consecutive trading days. Defense company stocks surged. Energy company stocks surged. Everything else fell. The VIX, Wall Street's fear index, spiked to levels not seen since the early days of the COVID pandemic. Central bank governors in multiple countries began emergency consultations about how to respond if energy inflation became embedded in the global economy. The economic damage was not theoretical. It was already happening. Now let us bring this back to the military dimension, because by day 11 of the conflict, something significant had shifted in the balance of power in the air. The United States had struck more than 3,000 targets inside Iran since February 28th. U.S. Admiral Brad Cooper reported that Iran's ballistic missile launch rate had fallen 90% from day one of the conflict. Drone launch rates had dropped 80%. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said the campaign was crushing Iran's military capacity. On the surface, those numbers sound like a decisive American advantage. And in terms of sheer attrition, the raw destruction of Iranian launch sites, production facilities, missile stockpiles, and logistical infrastructure, they are accurate. The US and Israel were systematically dismantling Iran's conventional military capacity. But here is what those numbers do not tell you. Iran had already fired over 500 ballistic missiles and nearly 2,000 drones in the first 5 days of the conflict. By day 5, Iran's own military was openly saying it had struck over 27 US bases across the region. Even at a 90% reduction, Iran was still launching missiles every day. And the Fattah-2, the weapon that could not be intercepted, was still flying. The trajectory of the war was not simply one side crushing the other. It was a competition between America's ability to degrade Iran's launch capacity faster than Iran could exhaust America's interceptor stockpiles. That second part of the equation is the one that defense analysts were talking about in whispered tones. Bloomberg reported that the US and Israel were at risk of running out of air defense missiles. The Patriot system, THAAD, David's sling, all of them use expensive, complex interceptors that take months or years to manufacture. Iran had launched so many missiles in the opening days of the conflict that the interceptor stockpiles were under genuine strain. Every time you fire a David's sling interceptor at an incoming Iranian ballistic missile, you're expending a weapon that costs several $1 million and takes time to replace. You can only fire each interceptor once. And if Iran keeps launching cheaper, mass-produced drones and missiles in large enough quantities, it can force air defense batteries to exhaust their ammunition and then send through the weapons that actually matter. This is what military strategists call a cost exchange problem. Iran spent very little per drone. The US and Israel spent millions per interceptor. At scale, that math becomes a serious vulnerability. The human dimension of this conflict was also expanding in ways that demanded attention. Iran's UN ambassador Amir Saeed Iravani told the United Nations that more than 1,300 civilians had been killed inside Iran since the strikes began. Iranian officials accused the US and Israel of deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. citing strikes on schools, hospitals, residential areas, the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, and the Golestan Palace, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. UNESCO issued a formal statement of concern after the palace was damaged in a March 2nd strike near Arg Square. A strike on Falak al-Aflaq, a historic castle marked with a UNESCO blue shield, damaged several sections of the site. Iran claimed that by day 11 of the conflict, nearly 10,000 civilian sites had been struck. In Lebanon, the conflict had drawn in Hezbollah. The group launched missiles into Israel in retaliation for the killing of Khamenei, and Israel responded with heavy bombardment of Beirut's southern suburbs and the Bekaa Valley. At least 570 people were killed in Lebanon in the first 11 days. Israel issued evacuation warnings for entire neighborhoods and was conducting ground operations in southern Lebanon. The Lebanese government banned Hezbollah's military activities, but had no practical ability to enforce that ban, while Israeli ground forces were moving through southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah was actively engaged. 7 U.S. service members had been killed in the conflict. Their caskets were returned to Dover Air Force Base in a solemn ceremony that President Trump attended. The political debate inside the United States was fierce. The U.S. Congress voted on a war powers resolution challenging Trump's authority to continue the strikes without congressional authorization. Most Republicans voted it down. A handful of Democrats joined them. The vote failed. But the political pressure was real, and it was growing. Inside Iran, something unexpected was happening alongside the military campaign. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians rallied in Tehran in support of Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader who had succeeded his father. People waved flags, chanted slogans, and what observers described as genuine expressions of national defiance in the face of the bombing were visible in the streets. At the same time, parts of the country were ghost towns. Civilians were afraid to leave their homes. Prisoners in Evin prison were reportedly receiving only bread and water. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The electricity grid in parts of Iran had been disrupted by strikes on energy infrastructure. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf said in a public statement that Iran was definitely not looking for a ceasefire. Ali Larijani, Iran's top security official, warned that Iran's forces were waiting for a potential U.S. ground invasion and threatened severe consequences for any secessionist groups that attempted to take advantage of the situation. He directly challenged Trump, writing on social media that Iran doesn't fear your empty threats. A Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi ruled out diplomacy in a CNN interview, saying Tehran would continue attacking Gulf countries and that the war would only end through economic pain. The Iranian foreign minister saying on CNN, not to Iranian state media but to a Western audience, that the only path to ending the war is economic pain directed at the United States and its allies is a strategic communication of extraordinary clarity. Trump, for his part, was sending his own signals. He told reporters the war could be over pretty quickly. He told NBC News he was not happy with Mojtaba Khamenei as Iran's new supreme leader. He said publicly that he intends to play a direct role in selecting Iran's next leader, calling Mojtaba an unacceptable choice. He posted on Truth Social calling Iran the loser of the Middle East. He told the Times of Israel that any decision on ending hostilities would be a joint one with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had framed the entire operation as removing what he called the existential threat posed by the terrorist regime in Iran. Meanwhile, Russia and the global energy dimension were adding yet another layer to this already extraordinary situation. Putin said Russia, the world's second-largest oil exporter, was ready to work again with European customers to deal with the global energy crisis. That statement was not a humanitarian gesture. That was Russia recognizing that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruption of Gulf oil exports had just handed Moscow extraordinary economic leverage over energy-dependent European nations. A war in the Middle East was potentially doing for Russia's energy income what no diplomatic maneuver had been able to accomplish since the Ukraine war began. China's position was equally complex. Beijing was watching its oil supply chain get disrupted while simultaneously trying to avoid being seen as either siding with Iran or endorsing the U.S.-Israel military campaign. China condemned the strikes, but had not taken any material action. Chinese researchers published a study in a military journal analyzing the limitations of U.S. missile defense against hypersonic weapons, a paper that was widely circulated in Western defense circles and was clearly intended to contribute to the strategic debate about how vulnerable American systems actually were. And hovering above all of this, never quite stated but always present in the background of every analysis, every briefing, every diplomatic conversation, was the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear program had been one of the primary justifications for the Operation Epic Fury strikes. U.S. and Israeli officials said they were targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure to prevent Tehran from reaching a level of immunity through nuclear deterrence. Trump said publicly that Iran had been preparing to attack Israel and would have used a nuclear weapon if it had possessed one. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said that military action was urgently necessary because delay would have allowed the Iranian regime to reach a level of immunity for its nuclear program. But here is the question that no official in Washington or Tel Aviv has fully answered publicly. What happens if Iran, feeling existentially threatened, having lost its supreme leader, having had its military systematically degraded, what happens if Iran decides that the only way to achieve genuine deterrence is to cross the nuclear threshold? What does that scenario look like? What does the world do then? These are not hypothetical questions anymore. These are questions that the security councils, the intelligence services, and the war rooms of every major power are working through right now in real time with incomplete information and enormous stakes. The Fattah-2 missile is in many ways the perfect metaphor for everything that is happening in this conflict. It is a weapon that arrives before the warning. It is a weapon that defeats the systems that were supposed to be invincible. It is a weapon that says the assumptions you built your security on are outdated. The playbook you have been running for 30 years no longer applies. The defenses you invested in, the treaties you relied on, the alliances you structured, all of it was built for a world where you could predict what was coming and position yourself to stop it. We are now in a world where things arrive before the warning, where markets react before governments can respond, where a single weapon, launched from one country and landing in another in under 5 minutes, can change the calculation for every power on Earth simultaneously. The story of Iran's Fattah-2 is not just a story about a missile. It is a story about the end of predictability, the end of the assumption that technology advantages are permanent, that layered defenses are impenetrable, that the rules that governed warfare for the last several decades will continue to govern warfare going forward. The Fattah-2 is the physical embodiment of a strategic shift that has been building for years. The shift from a world where the United States and its allies held a decisive technological edge in every military domain to a world where that edge is contested, challenged, and in certain specific scenarios, reversed. China is watching. Russia is watching. North Korea is watching. Every country that has been developing hypersonic technology is watching what happens when a nation actually deploys it against the world's most sophisticated air defense network. The results are being analyzed in laboratories and war colleges and intelligence agencies in every major capital on Earth. And the world economy is watching too. Because when the Strait of Hormuz closes, when oil hits $108 a barrel, when shipping routes that carry 20% of the world's oil supply become impassable, when Gulf cities that host global airlines and sovereign wealth funds and multinationals start hearing sirens, the entire architecture of globalized trade and energy supply becomes fragile in a way that was considered unthinkable as recently as 6 months ago. There is no clean ending to this story, not yet. The conflict is still evolving as of this recording. Iran has a new supreme leader who has not signaled any openness to negotiation. The US says it will not stop until its objectives are met. Israel says it is removing an existential threat. The Gulf states are caught between their dependence on American military protection and the very real damage being done to their cities and their reputations as stable investment destinations. Hezbollah is active in Lebanon. Iraq's militias are firing at US bases. A NATO member had an Iranian missile shot down in its airspace. The global economy is absorbing a shock that could become structurally embedded if this goes on for months rather than weeks. What we know with certainty is this. The Fattah-2 changed something fundamental about the strategic calculation in the Middle East. Not because it is invincible. Every weapon has a counter, and given enough time and resources, the US and Israel will develop better defenses. But because it arrived at a moment when the existing defenses were already stretched, when the strategic situation was already extraordinarily complex, and when it demonstrated, for the first time in actual combat, that a nation without nuclear weapons and without the world's largest defense budget could deploy a weapon that the most advanced air defense network on the planet currently cannot reliably stop. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. That is how long you have. That is the new clock. And right now, nobody has found a way to make it tick slower.